in your opinions, how do you think global security utilizes some of these concepts that fall under knowledge translation? A bit of a hefty question.
It is. I'm just trying to decide where I'd like to maybe start with that, and pardon me if it's kind of an indirect approach to your question. So I've been enthralled with the story of Alexander von Humboldt, who was this Prussian explorer in the very early, beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s, who, to put it in a very short way, took a trip as a young man for 5 years, it turned out, to South America, and mapped out the Andes and perceived basically that colonial era agricultural practices were affecting the climate even then, and that if you aggregated this to a global level, over time, man's activities, he was thinking, this was pre-industrial, he was thinking mostly from an agricultural point of view, would create a climate crisis, basically. And why I mention this now is because he was thinking in a whole systems way. And it was very, very ecologically sensitive and very future oriented. And I think it was a good example, even for now, of, if you want to talk about transnational collaboration as a solution, looking at these things through a global frame is absolutely essential, and also becoming more self-aware and even self-critical, I would say, about how we have practiced sort of an imperialism with just knowledge itself, that have left out other knowledge traditions, such as the indigenous knowledge traditions of all regions of the world, and what the impact has been of colonialism, which has similarly sort of marginalized different ways of knowing. And I've been influenced by, in thinking about this, by a professor whose work I just came across, whose name I'm not going to remember properly, but I think it's de Souza from Portugal, Santos de Souza, I hope I got that right, who has a book called The Cognitive Empire. So basically, we need to unpack all the things that were packed up so tightly and called disciplines since the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment of the mid 18th century. That was a time of great advances in knowledge and great organization of knowledge that actually led to all the disciplines and the practice of specialization that we have today. But von Humboldt was kind of running against the current then by putting it all back together, systems thinking in the early 1800s.
And I'm a big fan of von Humboldt's, and so my degree is in complex systems physics, which is really systems thinking, with lots of math. And so, when you talk about, knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation, really that was what I did as an intelligence officer. My job as a scientist inside of the intelligence community was to take science, whether it was the science of climate change or fisheries science or infectious disease science, and translate it and mobilize it and put it into the hands of the people who needed it. In my case, and Carol's case, it was the national security community. It was, in fact, very often the White House, and sometimes the head of state, the President of the United States. And so the issue of mobilizing knowledge and making it actionable, that's what the intelligence community does, right? Among other agencies inside of the government. And so this has kind of been all about, this has been my entire life. When I was a PhD student, and when I was a professor, when I was an intelligence analyst, and what I'm doing now is trying to take those scientific findings and make them understandable and relevant for people who need to act on it. Now, here's the problem. There are precious few of those people in the government who understand things like zoonotic spillover or antimicrobial resistance or climate change. Who, there are some, but if we think about the major risks to humanity, in the next decade or so, they're among those I just listed. And so it seems like at least the security communities of the nations that I'm familiar with are falling short internally of being able to translate science and scientific findings to those policymakers. And one thing that I noticed, I got extremely busy inside of the intelligence community because a lot of the questions coming down from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, or the President, or whatever, were increasingly scientific in nature, right? They were asking questions about this topic and that topic. It is the job of the security community to answer those to the best of their ability. If that community is not literate in climate or zoonotic spillover or whatever, then they're going to come up short in answering those questions. And if I may, very recently, the U.S. intelligence community was asked to assess the origins of the COVID-19, right? And so hopefully the security community has a lot of people trained that can understand zoonotic spillover at the molecular level. Otherwise, you may entertain other theories that are much less plausible, like maybe leaking from a lab.
Mm-hmm.